I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine. We look at the mood music in the West in a big week for budgetary decisions. And we interview Danylo Mokryk, War Crimes Investigations Unit reporter at the Kyiv Independent, about his work investigating the murder of Ukrainian children by Russian forces.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 7th of March, 2024, 2 years and 12 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls and Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Hi David, hi everybody. So at least five people were killed in a Russian missile strike yesterday, landed near a convoy carrying President Zelensky and the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. This was in Odessa. Mr. Mitsotakis told reporters the missile landed very close to the convoy. We think it was about 300 metres away. This was just after he and President Zelensky had visited Odessa's harbour, where the president was showing previous damage from strikes and explaining the port's importance to Ukrainian exports. Mr. Zelensky later on said, "You can see who we're dealing with. They don't care where they strike. I know there were casualties today, dead and wounded." Mr. Mitsotakis said the incident was the liveliest reminder that in Ukraine there is a real war going on. That's another reason that all European leaders should visit Ukraine. It's one thing to hear or see the description from the media or from President Zelensky, with whom we communicate regularly, and it's completely different to experience the war firsthand. I think well done, Mr. Mitsotakis. That's quite a punchy statement put out to his other world leaders, Donald Trump. Russian mill blogger Rybar, as we've said before, nationalist, ultra-nationalist, but not always totally wide of the mark. Hence we look at them. They reported that the strike was not a deliberate attempt to target Mr. Zelensky, but rather a coincidence. There has been chatter, a lot on social media, about it being a deliberate attempt on Zelensky's life and that of Mr. Mitsotakis. I'm not so sure. I wonder if they'd known President Zelensky was there, whether they would have tried harder to kill him. Again, there's also talk about, well, would it have been an Article 5 moment if Mr. Mitsotakis, obviously Greece is a member of NATO, had he been killed? Would that be Article 5? Chatting to folk today, we think it could have been viewed as such in the technical sense of the treaty, the most stringent sense of the treaty, but probably wouldn't have been viewed as such. However, what it might have done if Mitsotakis was killed, it may then have been the thing to change the current mindset in a lot of Western leaders and get them to really start funding and supporting Ukraine properly. But it might not have necessitated an actual declaration of war. So I'm not sure if Russia had known that Zelensky was there with Mitsotakis, would they have gone harder? I don't know, because at the moment, things you would imagine Putin views it's going his way. So does the Snow Dome need to be shaken and leaders brought front and centre to this by the potential death of a NATO leader? Russia might have decided it's not in their interest to do that. So I'm not so sure. I originally thought they might have gone harder to kill Zelensky, but I'm rowing back from that position a bit. But hey, what are your thoughts? Now then, generally across the country yesterday, Russian forces carried out 75 airstrikes, 5 missile strikes and 65 rocket attacks. This comes from Ukrainian Army's General Staff for this morning. In response, Ukrainian jets were said to have carried out 7 airstrikes on Russian troops, and their artillery brigades hit ammunition storage points and a number of artillery systems. Besides Avdiivka, the other principal battlegrounds at the moment seem to be the areas around Liman, Pavlivka, and just a couple of k's away from that village, Orhiv, the last two down in Zaporizhia Oblast in southeastern Ukraine. They are the areas of the salient that's pretty much all the Ukrainian counteroffensive managed to achieve last year. Now, Dmytro Likovoi, who's a spokesperson for the Tavria Group of Forces, speaking early today, said the Orhiv sector, that's down in the south there, that salient, the counteroffensive I was just mentioning, It is becoming an intense battleground. The enemy is trying to cut off the Robotina salient, as you'd expect, and they feel their tails are up at the moment. Now, linked to that, Ukrainian troops are said to be building fortifications in expectation of a Russian offensive in the spring, although there is a lot of chatter, a lot of worry that progress is not fast enough. This is an article in the Wall Street Journal today, citing Western officials and Ukrainian soldiers. Maxim Zorin, who's the deputy commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade, told the Wall Street Journal, "What's happening right now is what Russia has spent a long time preparing for. It has gathered enough forces and resources to pressure various axes all at once." We've been talking about that for some time, about the preparedness or lack of it from Ukraine's side. Russian shelling in Nicholls hit a shopping centre yesterday as well. That's on the right bank, the Ukrainian-held bank of the Dnipro, directly opposite the nuclear power plant down at Enerada. No casualties reported in that strike. Now, outside of the country, a major fire has broken out at a Russian military school in the city of Kazan. This is about 500 kilometers east of Moscow, used to train future tank crews and tank commanders. The fire broke out at the Higher Tank Training College. Future tank commanders learn their skills there. This is according to TASS, Russian state news agency. Preliminary reports suggest the cause of fire was an electrical wiring fault. However, there have been a number of these mysterious blasts over the last 2 years. Outside of the military sphere, General Vadim Skibitsky, who's the deputy head of Ukraine's intelligence directorate, he said half the shells given to Russia by North Korea are duds. He said the shells are more than half a century old and often do not work. General Skibitsky said, as of today, taking into account the available statistics, Russia has already imported 1.5 million rounds of ammunition from the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. However, he continued, these shells were made in the 70s and 80s. Half of them do not work and the rest need to be either repaired or checked before being used. He said North Korea gives away old stuff, ramps up the domestic production and asks for certain technologies in exchange, particularly missile and submarine technologies, with the aim of developing its own defence industry. This proves once again that Russia lacks its own production capacity for a rapid and powerful increase in missile production. If it did not, why would it ask North Korea? So, I mean, if a lot of them are duds, and we've seen some burst barrels, as in you put a shell that doesn't work properly, either the wrong fit or the explosive has degraded somewhat, it can go off in the barrel, and you get that sort of cartoon exploded cigar type thing where the barrel just splits, and it's catastrophic for the equipment and usually the crew. So we know some of them are a bit below par, but back to the old Lenin, it's quantity has a quality all of its own. South Korea's defence minister, you may remember, warned last month that North Korea had sent millions. We had a figure of 3 million, but we're not entirely sure. Interesting, General Skibitsky says 1.5 million. But we know North Korea has sent millions of artillery shells to Russia. This came after last September's summit between Kim Jong-un and Putin, where they deepened defence ties. And just finally for me, it's still going on. I've been watching some of it this morning. There's a conference in Tartu in Estonia about it's the annual conference. It's called the Conference on Russia. It's held annually. Retired US Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, chap we've had on the pod before, former US commander of forces in Europe. He gave the keynote address at the start. Interesting words. I'm going to quote quite extensively from him, but bear with me. He said, "We are witnessing the continued collapse of the Soviet Union, which started in 1991. It's not on a straight line, but decline. It's not on a straight line of decline, but it's unmistakable. A Russia containment strategy 2.0 is inevitable, and our best partner in terms of intelligence, understanding Russian psychology, and how to fight against Russia is going to be Ukraine. The survival of Ukraine and the necessity to bring Ukraine into NATO as soon as possible is paramount to a new European and global deterrence strategy." Now, he was talking. He talked about ammunition production. He said 70% of ammunition produced in Europe is sold outside Europe. So it's there. And he mentioned General Peter Pavel, Czech Republic, who said that he's identified 800,000 shells available on the open market for purchase now. So this stuff is there. General Hodges said Ukraine will be in a much better place by the end of this year in terms of ammunition, i.e. it's there. If people buy it and donate it, they'll be in a good place. He said there's lots of ammunition and potential out there. We've just got to get our arms around it and have the political will to deliver it. Speaking of the battlefield now, he said the narrative around the war right now is overly gloomy and defeatist. He said Russia's Black Sea Fleet, or calling it a Black Sea Fleet, is just a cool name. He said General Syrski's task now is to stabilise the situation and fix the problems ready for the future. He highlighted, this is General Hodges highlighted, he said the lack of mobilisation risks undermining support from Western nations, although he accepted it's very much a political decision. But he was saying Western nations looking on, and he said that there are 2 million people of fighting age that could be brought into the military if the political decision was there. He then went on, he said he was very proud, he said, I'm very proud of what my president and my country have done, but they have stopped short. They have failed the test of clearly identifying a strategic objective. That should obviously be that Ukraine wins. My president has used this terrible phrase that we're with you for as long as it takes, a phrase we criticise regularly on the pod. General Hodges went on, that is an empty statement that does not bring one round of ammunition. He said, unfortunately, our German allies use the same phrase. They're not alone. He went on, when we say that Ukraine should win, there's no more silly arguments about, well, we don't have enough ATACMS or Abrams burns too much fuel. Those are all excuses because we don't have a strategic objective. When the president says it and the German chancellor says it, then the Russians will realise that their hope of waiting for us to get tired and quit is over. We need to return to the clarity of Churchill and Roosevelt, who gave strategic priorities and strategic objectives to their nations, their industries and their militaries. So there you go, end of quote. Worth looking up if you've got, he was speaking for about 20 minutes, but the conference is good. You'll find it online. Have a look at Tartu Annual Conference on Russia. You can watch some of that back. I thought very good. He's very clear, Ben Hodges. We've spoken to him before. He shows great clarity of thought. We just hope that some of these arguments land in the chancelleries and the corridors of power where they should do. But I'll take a pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis Dearnley, let's come to you next. And I think this is probably our first episode when we've all been back together in the office since we've all got back from Ukraine at different times. So it's very good to have both of you with me today. Francis, there's been a lot of developments in the West politically. Where would you like to start?
Well, thanks, David. It's good to have you back. Dom was mentioning there defence spending, and it's a big week for budgetary announcements. So I think it is worth our reflecting together today on the mood music in the West in response to the evolving situation on the battlefield. Wearing my comment editor hat, I spent a good deal of yesterday talking to one of Britain's former chancellors about the current Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget that was announced in the House of Commons over lunchtime, hence why I wasn't on the pod. Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, was also in Telegraph Towers watching it unfold. One of the most surprising things about it, something that is leading to considerable comment this morning, was its very little reference to defence matters. This is despite the fact that the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps told Dom just a few weeks ago in a press conference that the UK is in a pre-war world and was putting itself on a pre-war footing. And as Deborah Haynes from Sky has written today, the level of funding set out in official budget tables yesterday appeared to track a decline of £2.5 billion in defence spending in the coming financial year, although the MOD said it's because the data didn't include the new money that was pledged last autumn and further assistance for Ukraine. That may be so, but as Deborah writes, the absence of any major announcement on defence spending has been met with dismay among many military insiders. The only new defence-related pledge was for up to £26 million to support a bid by the Office for Veterans Affairs to hold the Invictus Games in Birmingham in 2027. That is despite the Russian economy being on a war footing, the threat of United States withdrawal under a re-elected Donald Trump, and China increasing its defence budget by more than 7%. Furthermore, Germany's defence spending is now set to outpace the UK by 2025, according to new projections. The International Institute for Strategic Studies say that Germany would be spending around $120 billion per year on defence in 2030 compared to Britain, which is projected to spend around £90 billion. Is this evidence that Germany is finally responding to what Olaf Scholz called the Zeitenwende of the Russian invasion? Perhaps in terms of future spending, although there remain big questions regarding the degree to which this is increased spending in real terms versus adjusting for inflation. Furthermore, the utility of that spending in the context of Ukraine has also been challenged, given the long-term frames involved and the hesitancy to provide certain weaponry, such as Taurus, which we've discussed many times on the podcast. Now, staying on funding, Joe Biden is attempting, we learned today, to tap into US Army funds to provide short-term assistance to Ukraine. That's coming from Bloomberg. Drawing on Pentagon funds would free up around $200 million in aid to Kyiv, a source familiar with the matter said. The proposal comes, of course, as that US aid bill providing $60 billion worth of critical weapons and equipment to Kyiv remains tied up in Congress, as we've discovered so much recently. Further evidence of solutions trying to be found in Washington to the funding crisis this. Be in no doubt, when we were in Ukraine, the matter of funding was a core subject of conversation amongst almost everybody that we spoke to. This is not some abstract concern concocted by journalists and politicians. It really matters. As one senior figure put it to me, the consequences of funding failures in Washington can be measured in lives in Ukraine. Pretty stark. The importance of this should only be underlined by a report of the Lithuanian intelligence services that Russia has the resources to fight on in Ukraine at the current intensity for at least 2 years. High oil prices, sanctions evasion and state investment helped Russia bolster its battle-torn army last year, the report claims, adding that Moscow is on track to expand its military capabilities along its border with NATO. Moscow is able to evaluate the lessons learned and improve its combat effectiveness, the report said. A core focus of that report is sanctions, as I say, and the agencies add that Russian intelligence is working hard to evade Western attempts to stop resources getting to them. In addition to Iran and North Korea providing arms, China has become its largest supplier of microchips, and the yen has become the main currency for Russia's international transactions. Now, on that subject, the Business for Ukraine charity has just published a detailed analysis, sector by sector, of what can be done, to use their phrase, to defund Russia's war. One of their core recommendations is to look more closely at third countries and parties who are being used to get material into Russia. So they call for countries to stop selling resources to certain other countries who can easily then funnel them to Moscow. And I'll add a link in the description to that report, which is well worth reading for anyone working on that topic. But to end on what is undoubtedly the most historic news of the day, we expect that it will be today, Thursday, the 7th of March, 2024. That will be the day Sweden joins NATO. It will depend on the speed of ratification, but that's what we're hearing on the wires. It follows Hungary and Turkey, of course, withdrawing their vetoes following extensive discussions over the past year or so. It means that the security alliance now circles the entire Baltic Sea, home of one of Russia's fleets, as well as a key oil trading route. The Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake, Latvia's foreign minister told the Financial Times today. The entire security of the region is made stronger because it makes the Eastern Baltic less vulnerable. In becoming the 32nd member of the US-led alliance, Sweden brings with it the mid-Baltic island of Gotland, dubbed a giant aircraft carrier, which makes defending Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia much easier. Russia, unsurprisingly, has vowed countermeasures over Sweden's entry, especially if alliance troops and assets deploy in the country. But its lack of response relative to supposed NATO encroachment, their term, speaks volumes for many as to what their real motivations in Ukraine were, as we've discussed at length recently. Now, just to end, another bit of news which I know Dom referenced yesterday that's relevant to this is the development that Moldova and France have signed a defence cooperation accord as part of the West's efforts to strengthen the former Soviet state's capabilities amid what they fear are increasing efforts by Moscow to destabilise Moldova. It is yet another attempt, I think, to bolster those grey zones that are not in NATO and are therefore vulnerable to Russian aggression. Grey zone being a category, of course, which Sweden and Finland arguably belonged to until their accession to the alliance this year. At last, it seems, the West is being proactive rather than merely reactive in that area. But this question of defence spending remains key, especially given the anxieties of the future of the US in the European defence context. The time for urgent decisions is now, for all the reasons we've discussed most recently with our guest from Rand last week. Tomorrow, as he said, may well be too late.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Francis. Dom, let's go to you first then for your final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I've been also thinking about the budget yesterday, and also what it speaks of more broadly. I was drawn to a tweet from Matthew Saville, who's the director of military sciences at RUSI, the think tank here in London, Royal United Services Institute, and a former civil servant. Matthew is a former civil servant. He said it's a reminder when calculating the NATO 2% figure that in Britain, the MOD includes the cost of operations when it talks about spending, but the Treasury, when they're talking about the defence budget, does not. So you build your armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, etc., to do a certain thing, but then you obviously can't budget in for what you might spend on any operations, war, etc., because you just don't know what you're going to be doing. So that extra funding that then goes and supplies the fuel and all the food that you might not otherwise have used up, or all the expendables and extra weapons, that it used to be called NACMO, net additional cost to military operations. I don't know if the term is still used, but that additional cost of going to war was always picked up by the Treasury. And I think it's very interesting. I hadn't, until he reminded me, I'd forgotten that, of course, the MOD counts all these additional costs of operations, and probably, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing they would include anything that they are supplying to Ukraine in the defence budget from which they say we're meeting 2% of NATO's target. But that's not the money allocated to them by the Treasury. So, feeling a bit down on our politics here at the moment, and in particular yesterday, the budget, after David Cameron, Lord Cameron, our new Foreign Secretary, only in January said it's hard to think of a time when there's been so much danger and insecurity and instability in the world. To have the defence outcome yesterday, or the utter lack of a defence outcome from the budget, I'm not too impressed, quite frankly. And I wanted to reiterate Matthew Saville's point about how you calculate GDP and NATO 2%. It was laid at MOD's door a couple of years ago that they were including things like pensions and what have you. My military pension, but that doesn't equate to. You shouldn't be including that in the 2% figure for NATO when talking about GDP. So there's all sorts of smoke and mirrors here. I'm just saying politicians will, of course, look to put the finest gloss on it, but we should be very careful about looking at some of these figures, and actually actions speak a hell of a lot louder than words and just rubbish numbers. But not too thrilled with British politics at the moment when it comes to defence.
Thank you very much. Dom, Francis, would you like the very final words?
Well, I just wanted to agree with what Dom said there. I couldn't help but think that if things did go horribly in the years ahead, that historians would look at that budget and would say it was remarkable that defence was not a core feature of it. Of course, from our perspective, defence is the critical issue, but it speaks to the fact that it is not for many politicians in Europe at the moment. It does bear repeating that given the urgency of matters, it remains domestic affairs that still dictate how most politicians and chancellors are thinking about their own spending. But just speaking about spending, I referenced the Business for Ukraine report earlier and the attention it draws to certain loopholes. One of those is energy, and it features, I think, the report, the most concise summation of what has been happening in that specific context that I have read. And I'm just going to read that now, because when you see it in black and white, described as such, I think it's very stark. Since the start of the war, the Kremlin amassed $650 billion in revenue from its fossil fuel trade. The bulk of these earnings come from crude oil, despite the price cap and the oil embargo adopted by the EU, the US, and other G7 countries. The so-called refining loophole allows Russia to legally ship its oil products refined by third countries, such as India and China, to the US and the EU. Russia's shadow fleet of tankers allows it to sell its crude above the established price cap of $60 per barrel. The fact that almost half of Russia's crude oil was carried out on tankers owned or insured by G7 EU constituents, significant leverage for the coalition countries. Europe plays a central role in replenishing the Kremlin's war coffers by continuing to buy Russia's liquefied natural gas, currently not subject to sanctions. In 2023 alone, Russia was able to export 50% more natural gas to Europe than in 2021. The role of Western firms, from engineering to oil servicing ones, in aiding Russia's fossil fuel sector with critical technology and know-how remains paramount. Stark analysis, and that is just one major example of a loophole. There are many others. The fact is, we often question why sanctions have not worked. This is how. This is why the Russian economy remains able to carry out its war in Ukraine. The other thought that occurred to me reading this is that in order for a report like this to reach these conclusions, it takes a lot of people, academics, business people, journalists, thousands, tens of thousands probably of hours to piece all of this information together. I mean, I remember our first reporting on the rumours of shadow fleets probably over a year and a half ago. So just a credit to all of those who do that really important work. But it also speaks to the challenge here that Moscow has been planning this for a very, very long time, ways of skirting around sanctions. And it takes the West much longer to piece together what's really been going on and respond to it. Politicians are waking up, and there are big initiatives now to try and do more to get around these sanctions. But evidently, I think we can now say definitively that sanctions have not worked to anywhere near the degree that was expected. And we need to come to terms with that and reach a conclusion about what the next steps are, because currently a lot of work needs to be done.
Coming up, we hear from the Kyiv Independent's War Crimes Investigations reporter, Danylo Mokryk. Danylo does hugely important and powerful work looking at war crimes committed by the Russian army. In this interview, we speak about his documentary on Russia's killing of Ukrainian children. We'll add a link to that documentary to our show notes, so do find it there. And just a note to our listeners, this interview covers extremely distressing topics. Here's my conversation with Danylo.
My name is Danylo Mokryk. I'm an investigative reporter at the Kyiv Independent's War Crimes Investigation Unit. And my job is to investigate Russian war crimes and to produce documentaries about them.
Can we talk about one of your documentaries on the deliberate killing of Ukrainian children? And you looked at 3 case studies, Vlad near Kyiv, Katya in Kharkiv, and Mikhailo down in Zaporizhia. How did you find these families, these children in the first place?
Well, unfortunately, it's not hard to find victims of Russian war crimes in general, and it's not hard to find families of the killed children, because there are so many of them. There are at least 36 of Ukrainian children that were killed at close distance by bullets, not by missiles and not by artillery attacks. And, I've been reaching out to those families since 2022. The first story I made on the subject was in May 2022. It was actually the difficulty in that was to choose which stories to tell, because they are all tragic and they all value attention. They require attention. So the difficult part was not to find the victims. The difficult part was to choose which stories to tell.
Can you explain why you chose Vlad, Katya and Mikhailo?
Well, I chose partially thinking about geography. I wanted to show the systematic nature of the child killings by the Russian army. And so I chose one story from the south, one story from the north, and one story from the east, to encompass the Ukrainian territory. And another thing was, well, each killing of a child is anyway senseless. But those three, there was really no reason for the Russian soldiers to shoot at those children. So those stories struck me by the absolute senselessness of those killings. That's also something that I wanted to show in my documentary. It's not a whodunit, the investigation. It's not really about identifying the exact soldier that shot the kid. The idea was to show the circumstances and the way it is happening, the way the Russian army operates, because the bottom line is that it's not some trigger-happy soldier that is an exception. We are talking about the way they are behaving in general. It's not about name, surname. It's about the Russian army as it is, as it exists, as it operates.
I mean, in English you might say it's not one bad apple, it's an entire barrel which is rotten. How much do you think this has got to do with this idea of impunity? Nobody thought they'd be held to account. Nobody thought that people would even know. How much does that play into it, do you think?
It has a lot to do with impunity, actually, because the thing is that the Russian army behaves like that every time. Each time they go into action, they invade or they conduct an operation, be it in Chechnya, be it in Syria, be it in Georgia, they do the exact same thing. I mean, they do not feel that there might be consequences for what they are doing. They are almost never prosecuted at home. The Russian state does not really prosecute Russian soldiers for their war crimes. So this feeling of impunity does play into that, because you are in this setting of death, blood, fighting. You have all those hormones taking the wheel, actually. And if your brain does not tell you that you have to stop because you might be punished for that, you just act. And that's what they do. There is a culture of impunity in the Russian army. This is what we have seen in their last military campaigns, and this is something that is happening now. Moreover, sometimes they even get rewarded for their war crimes, actually, because one of the brigades responsible for what happened in Bucha in March 2022, the 64th Brigade, and after they retreated, like 2 or 3 weeks after that, Vladimir Putin actually rewarded the brigade. So they even encouraged them in a way to commit atrocities.
I mean, in my head, I think if I was in an army and I knew that, and I believed that I would not be prosecuted, I would like to think that I still wouldn't kill children, that there'd be still some moral thing holding me back from doing, or I'd say to other people. What do you think is lacking, or what's different about
I don't think that you were raised in in a setting of glorifying war as a concept, as a phenomenon. The Russian culture is about glorifying war and glorifying bloodshed. Russian Victory Day on the 9th of May is not about mourning and is not about reflecting on tragedies. It is about celebrating war. And it goes way back in the Russian culture. If you, for example, take time to read Pushkin's poem, The Prisoner of Caucasus, the very end of it, it is celebrating the bloodshed that Russians committed in the Caucasus. It is glorifying massacres. So this idea to celebrate violence is ingrained quite deep in the Russian mentality, and I think it makes them a bit different from your average Occidental culture, Western culture.
When you were speaking to the families of the children, could you explain a little bit to our audience how you go about this incredible, I can't imagine a more difficult conversation to have with a parent. How do you do that? How do you do that sensitively? How do you, it'd be interesting to hear your process and what that was like for you.
Well, first of all, you have to be sympathetic with them. You have to treat them as human beings and you have to treat their stories as tragedies, as source of enormous suffering for them, and not as a raw material for your work, not as something you want to turn into a documentary or to sell it. So this is the most important thing, to treat them as human beings and to be compassionate, to be sympathetic, and also, well, when it comes to talking to the victims, I find it very important to make them feel somehow in control of what is happening, to allow them to stop if they need to stop, to allow them to tell me to switch off the camera. It's even about small decisions that you let them take about where do you want to sit, how do you want to sit, what do you want to drink, coffee or tea. So you make them feel in control. The problem with the victims often is that their tragedy is about losing control, is about not being in control of what is happening. Their child is killed and there is nothing they can do about that. The war is happening and there is nothing they can do about it. So giving them back this feeling of control, I find it very important. But and you are thinking about all that while you are interviewing them, and you are trying to be, sensitive about how they behave. You are trying to look at how their facial expressions change, how their voice change. So in the moment when you are conducting the interview, you do not really. What I want to say is that rewatching the recorded interviews, to me it was much more painful than conducting them in the moment, because you have to think in the moment. You have to think about all those different aspects of what is going on. That it doesn't let all of this sink in. It is only later when you rewatch that it is painful to me.
When you look back at those children who lost their lives, what did you learn about them and the people they could have been? All children are slightly different. The generations that come after us are us, but it's like different things. What did you learn about the next generation of Ukrainian children who had their lives taken away?
Well, they were just ordinary children, actually, like the way you see them anywhere. They were They liked gadgets very much. They spent a lot of time on social media, and not the social media of my generation. I'm not talking like, Facebook or Twitter. They were on TikTok, and they were spending a lot of time on there. They were creating a lot of content, so it was very important to them. And they grew up so fast. Actually, one of the kids, the Vlad from the Kyiv region, he was killed he was 12 at the time, and he expected to earn his own life by the age of 16. So they were really growing very fast. They were eager to live. And the other girl, the 10-year-old Katya, she wanted very much to be a blogger. So me, when I was that age, 10 or 12, I did not want to grow up. I did not want to become independent. I did not want to earn my own life at that time yet. And they were already thinking about that. So that they are more. My impression is that this generation is much more intense than I used to be at the time.
When you sort of stand back and consider what happened, the kind of, as we've spoken about, the senseless evil, it's difficult, I think, to, in my head anyway, to take a stance. Like, is it silence? Is it to anger, like the utter sort of deep swell of anger of people who did this and the society that produced that, the ability that this would happen? After having looked at these stories, where do you stand? How do you emotionally sort of look at it? How do you approach the kind of heart of darkness that leads to 10-year-olds being shot?
Well, to be honest, it's hard for me to identify the emotions, my emotions about that. It is a mixture of pain, of despair, of hatred, or of everything. But then again, the thing is that I chose this topic. I chose to investigate the killings of children exactly because that was something that pained me the most. It's like, this absolute red line when it comes to war crimes. And every time I learned about yet another Ukrainian child killed, it made me want to scream as a human being. And, this is exactly this urge to scream that I tried to turn into something productive, something that could be useful. So this is about the emotion that is on the background of that. But when it comes to what I feel after that, what I feel about the behavior of the Russian army, I don't know. It's a mixture of pain, hatred, and despair. But I try not to let it affect my work as a journalist. I do feel it, but my work is not about expressing my feelings. It's about expressing my findings.
Looking at the families you spoke to who lost their children, do you have a sense of how they are trying to rebuild their lives? And if so, how are they doing that? What kind of support is available after the fact?
Well, they are very different in how they cope with the pain. One family is very supportive of each other. They have adopted another child, a 12-year-old boy, and they got on pretty well with their lives. Another family tries to have another child to sort of fill the void, and you may see the tragedy actually in each of those choices. Adopting another child or trying to have another child, to give birth to another child, that is somehow also tragic. It's trying to fill a void, but the void is actually an abyss. It's, it's hard to fill. And there is the third family, they did not even want to talk to me, the parents. And I have to respect their wishes not to talk to me, because the pain is too big for them to give an interview or even to meet me, to talk to me about it. So I find it very important to respect their feelings and not to pry. Because to me, no story is worth more than the suffering of the victims.
Are you able, as a man and a journalist, to separate these feelings, to be able to leave what you found and to leave how it affected you at work? Or do you find that does follow you around?
I think I can. I'm not, I'm not super young, so I have quite a lot of experience. And before the full-scale invasion, I have been investigating corruption in Ukraine for 6 years, something like that. And that was something that was infuriating for me too. I understood how corruption was corroding Ukrainian society, and it was infuriating. But I still had to separate this emotion from my findings and the presentation of those findings. So ultimately, yeah, I think I managed to do that. And there's a whole team around me to make sure that I do that. So I have those who fact check me, I have those who proofread me, and they take care that they are there to correct my course if I go astray.
If you could leave our listeners with a final thought about everything we've just spoken about, what would that be?
Well, it's hard for me to summarize actually my experience about this war, but what I'm really trying to say by my documentaries too is that you hear a lot about Russian war crimes in Ukraine expressed in numbers, like there are hundreds of children killed. There are tens of thousands of civilians killed, and so on and so on. It's often about numbers. To me, it is very important to explain that it is each one in this number is a tragedy. So it's not 1,000 lives. It's one time. It's 1,000 times one tragedy. One prayer unanswered, one abyss, one bullet hole that goes so deep that you would find it hard to see the end of it. I'd like for people to understand that each number is about tragedies and tragedies and tragedies and human lives and worlds destroyed. So to see beyond, to see what is behind those numbers.
Dearnley, thank you so much. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.